The wind dropped just as the MH-47 leveled into hover. Its dark frame cast a hard-edged shadow across the rock, fading into the evening's chalk haze. Below, the landing zone was a scatter of loose shale and compacted dust, sloped unevenly toward the ridgeline. One by one. The Marines of Eagle 2 stepped off and practiced rhythm. Their boots hit ground without wasted movement, each impact sending a soft puff of pale grit into the air. The helicopter didn't linger. It lifted and banked west. The downdraft sweeping a curtain of dust over the figures now crouched low with weapons at ready. Captain Jordan Riker moved first. No orders spoken, just a glance toward the incline and a tap of two fingers at his side. The others responded without question. Riker didn't walk fast. He didn't need to. His authority came not from volume, but from consistency. And the team had long since learned that when he moved, the safest direction was wherever he was already headed. Gunnery Sergeant Mason Holt followed at a half-step, heavier in his gear, older by a margin, his breath audible in the thinning air. Corpsman Lila Penn brought up center, her posture upright, eyes scanning from beneath the brim of a sand-smudged cap. Scout sniper. Tay Griggs trailed at an angle, rifle slung high, chewing faintly on something dry between his teeth. Andrew Shaw, the youngest by far, kept checking his tablet display as if willing the satellite feed to stabilize. He hadn't spoken yet, but his glances bounced between Griggs and Holt every few seconds, trying to find the right rhythm. The terrain was merciless stone stacked in broken layers, some sections bleached white by wind, others dark from old water runoff. No vegetation, no animal tracks, no sound but boots and breath. The sun had dropped low behind the ridge, leaving only dull orange wash across the upper cliffs and a deepening blue that crawled across the canyon walls. Chalk dust floated in suspension, fine enough to cling to sweat, clump in lashes, and turn every exposed edge of gear the same pale shade. Riker paused near a boulder outcrop, knelt, and unfolded a small laminated map from his sleeve pocket. The paper's corners were curled, its surface worn soft with use. Thin lines in red ink traced elevation drops and sightline notations, but some had already faded under fingerprints. He pressed one gloved hand to steady the page, tracing a marked approach vector with his thumb. His fingers were dusted white. So were his boots, his rifle sling, the clasp of his compass. Everyone's gear had taken on the same coat sweat mixed with chalk, a camouflage of erosion. No one questioned the silence. A few clipped words passed over comms, more acknowledgments than conversation. Shaw noted a local repeater tower ahead. Griggs checked scope elevation. Penn adjusted her sling, eyes catching briefly on a ridge to the east. Holt muttered something about the wind shifting but didn't finish the thought. There was nothing loud in the moment, yet tension coiled beneath it. The mission was straightforward: confirm, report, withdraw. But the clarity felt artificial. The lab's location had come too quickly, the insertion too clean, and the terrain, though empty, felt lived in, shaped by something unseen. Riker studied the map again, then folded it carefully, sealing the edge with the same slow crease he'd made a dozen times before. He didn't trust digital overlays. This was the only copy that mattered. As they moved on, their outlines blurred against the landscape. Dust clung to everything. Sweat ran in slow tracks under their armor. The mountains swallowed their sounds. Beneath their silence was a weight not yet named, a sense that control was already slipping, and the truth might not be waiting at the end of the trail. They reached the ridge just as the last of the twilight gave way to a darker blue sinking into the valley. The terrain climbed in sharp steps, broken shelves of rock stacked by wind and time. No path, just instinct and altitude. Jordan Riker led them to a saddle-shaped rise where the line of sight stretched over the basin. Below, in a low depression cut into the rock, stood the compound. At first glance, it looked like a mining station too neat. too isolated. But under thermal, the outlines told a different story. Tay Griggs adjusted the magnifier on his scope. His voice came low, not quite a whisper. Got 3 moving near the south bank. Suits, not local fabric. Andrew Shaw hunched beside him. Tablet dimmed. Antenna extended like a praying mantis limb. Intercepted something. Short burst. High compression. Russian packet structure. Not warlord-grade encryption. His mouth twitched. But he didn't look up. Weird fit. Whole layout's weird, Griggs added, sweeping the scope across the west wing. Ventilation stacks too modern. Corner joins are beveled. Prefab quality. This ain't slapped together by shovel and spare parts. Riker didn't respond. He was studying the facility through a monocular, then looking down at his map. Then back again. The compound had 4 visible structures, 1 guard shack, and a perimeter wall made of poured cement. Not cinder block. Too symmetrical, too clean. He didn't say what he felt, but he shifted slightly as he knelt, one hand pressing the map flat across a flat rock, palm holding it against a gust of wind. Lila Penn crouched nearby, eyes on the southern access road, weapon low across her knees. She didn't speak. Her silence had its own weight measured, deliberate, unflinching. Command's reply came after a delay, voice flat, sterile. Target confirmed. Proceed to exfil point Bravo after strike. Window narrow. Package inbound. Riker gave a single nod and keyed his transmitter. Eagle 2 confirms. Standing off. There was a pause 30 seconds that stretched long. Then the jets came. They didn't hear them at first, only felt it pressure drop, a shiver in the air. Then the dull, full-throated scream of a pair of F-35s cutting low and fast over the western ridge, missiles already gone. Impact came hard and fast. No warning, no buildup, just silence. Then flame. The blast wasn't cinematic. It was direct, focused. The northern building vanished under the first hit, a fireball punching upward in a vertical column. The second strike hit closer to the perimeter, tearing through the western flank and sending a wave of debris into the nearby wash. For a moment, the ridge where they watched lit orange, then paled again into shadow. Ash began to drift. It came in slow patterns, not from above but from the churned earth itself, chalk dust lifted by shockwave and fire, mingling with soot from inside the compound. It coated their shoulders and gear like frost. Riker blinked once and raised a gloved hand to wipe the edge of his optics. The sweat under his collar turned gritty. Griggs exhaled. Well, that's one way to sign off. Shaw tapped his screen, trying to get a drone relay ping. Comms are glitching, packet delay on uplink. Might be terrain. The static came first faint, irregular, then a half-formed chirp from the relay, followed by dead tone. He tried again. Nothing. Penn finally spoke. Airspace interference. Shaw just shook his head. Below, the compound continued to burn, but the smoke already started to flatten. The strike was clean. Surgical. No visible secondary targets. No vehicles had fled. No alarms went off. Riker felt it in his chest before it made sense something should have moved. He drew the map again. This time he unfolded it all the way. The exfil route was marked in red, a dry tributary canyon winding west toward a shallow LZ. Coordinates had come via a local liaison, someone embedded in the interim government. Riker stared at the line. The paper in his hand shivered slightly in the mountain wind. The fold he made this time was slow, tight. His fingers creased the edge with deliberate pressure. Mason Holt, standing slightly uphill, watched the smoke curl. Something about this stinks. No one answered. They didn't have to. The team checked their gear, falling into post-strike discipline. Griggs reloaded slowly. Shaw kept trying the comlink with no luck. Penn moved to check the ridgeline before they descended. The silence stretched again. No gunfire, no retreating alarms, just a compound fully erased, a ridge coated in pale ash, and a folded map that no longer felt like a compass, only an artifact. Command's voice returned, distant and clear. Strike confirmed. Exfil immediately. Do not linger. Debrief not required. Riker looked up at the sky. It was empty. He clipped the map back into his sleeve and stood. The dust clung to his boots like chalk marks on a dry board. They began their descent into the canyon just after the smoke column from the strike had thinned to a pale ribbon behind them. The trail dropped fast, sharp angles, brittle rock underfoot, the kind of path that punished ankles and slowed formation. Jordan Riker kept to the front, eyes down on the map drawn from his sleeve again, folded wide against a flat plastic insert. The tributary route snaked through the base of the cliffs and led west toward the LZ. It was marked red. Same as before. The coordinates matched what Command had pushed. He glanced back once, confirming spacing, then moved down. Mason Holt was behind him, steady but wary. Tay Griggs moved third, rifle sweeping high along the ledge line. Lila Penn stayed low, just behind Andrew Shaw, who was still tapping his gear, trying to boost the relay signal. Riker heard him mutter something about packet corruption, but didn't break stride. The blast caught them just before the trail narrowed into a switchback. There was no warning. One step, then heat, noise, pressure like the sky turned inside out. The IED buried under the path detonated upward and to the left, throwing Griggs into the canyon wall with such force his helmet split at the side seam. Dust bloomed instantly, swallowing the trail. A second later came the sharp whine of rifle fire from above. Rounds slammed into the rock around them, sharp pings and cracking echoes. Riker hit the ground first, shoulder first into the stone, yelling nothing, just a single arm raised toward the opposite ledge. Holt had already swung around, returning fire in bursts, jaw tight. Penn slid to Griggs and tried to pull him into cover, blood already spreading along his thigh and chest plate. Shaw scrambled behind a boulder, cursing under his breath, fingers flying across the side of his comm unit. Static drowned the channel. He switched bands. Static again. They're on elevated rock west and east flanks, Holt shouted without looking back. His rounds found nothing. Dust choked the trail, turned the firefight into shapes and muzzle flash. Signal's dead, Shaw snapped, wrenching an antenna higher. I've got nothing, no drone. No link. His voice cracked on the second word. The static poured through his headset like water. Penn's gloves were soaked in blood now, pressing into Griggs's torso. He was breathing, barely, and his eyes were wide, confused. One leg twitched once and stilled. He needs medevac now, she said, though no one could grant it. Riker scanned fast. He remembered a fallback marker side cave, 80 meters south, carved into the bluff face. It was on the map. He waved the team forward, grabbed Shaw by the back of the vest, and pulled him toward the ridge bend. Penn didn't wait. She threw her shoulder under Griggs's upper body and dragged him through the haze. Holt pulled rear cover, firing tight, controlled bursts that sparked on the cliffs above them. The cave was real, but the exit wasn't. They reached it breathless, stumbling inside as rounds pinged off the outer ledge. The interior dropped 5 meters, dark and sharp with sediment dust. The far exit was a narrow shaft supposed to lead to a ravine, a route Riker had marked based on the command brief. It was sealed, collapsed. Rubble filled the far end. Boulders the size of duffel bags stacked over themselves in frozen motion. Penn dropped Griggs onto the flattest section she could find. His eyes weren't blinking anymore. Her hands didn't stop moving for a while. Shaw knelt beside them, trying to clear blood from his chest with a canteen trickle. Holt slumped near the wall, lip split, dirt across one cheek. This wasn't a random ambush, he said low. No one answered. Riker pulled the map again. This time slower, less precise. The crease was jagged now, stained red near the bottom edge. A fingerprint smudge ran along the exfil path. His own inked note sat just beneath it. Meaningless now. He looked at the rock pile across the shaft. It hadn't caved in days ago. This was fresh. The dust hadn't settled. A trap. He didn't speak, just folded the map again. Slower this time, his hand holding it like something once trusted, now broken. Griggs exhaled once more, then stopped. Penn didn't look up. Her hands were still pressed to the vest. The blood beneath her knees had already soaked through. Shaw shifted backward, blinking too fast. "They used our map," he said finally. "They fed it to us." Dust floated in the beam of his headlamp, thick as smoke. Outside, the gunfire tapered off. No one followed them into the cave. Maybe they didn't need to. Riker stood slowly. His gear was torn open along one shoulder, radio antenna bent at the base. He moved to the edge of the cave and looked out across the slope. There was nothing to see, only broken trail, the impression of a blast crater, and the faint rise of dusk light catching in the airborne chalk. His hand brushed the edge of his collar, then fell. No speeches, no questions. The air was too dry to carry echoes. They had no signal, no route, no evac. Griggs's rifle still leaned against the far wall, untouched. Their uniforms were soaked at the seams, sweat, blood, and dust formed a second skin. No part of their gear looked new. Every angle was ground down. In the dim light of the cave, the map sat folded beside Riker's boot, one edge torn, one corner marked with a false promise. They weren't being hunted. They had been placed, and now they were alone. The cave was colder now. The wind outside had faded, but the stone walls held its memory in layers, wrapping the space in stillness. They hadn't spoken in 20 minutes. Shaw sat propped against the inside ledge, one leg stretched, the other drawn close. His right hand kept drifting toward his ribs, where the shrapnel had torn through the side of his plate carrier. Blood had slowed, but hadn't stopped. His face was gray, eyes dull but tracking. Holt had bandaged him with field wrap torn from his own kit. Nothing sterile remained. Penn knelt a few feet away, scraping old rock into a dent in the floor to make a flatter surface for gear. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She didn't look up. She hadn't since Griggs stopped breathing. Riker knelt beside Shaw and unlatched the front pouch of the young Marine's rig. Inside, beneath the crushed energy packs and a water tab tube, was the encrypted drive metal casing, worn black, same kind used for brief transfers off unsecured antennas. Shaw looked at it, then at Riker, and gave a shallow nod. "No uplink," Shaw said, voice barely audible, "but I pulled it just in case." Riker didn't answer. He turned the drive over once in his hand, checked the casing, then connected it to the decrypt cable that ran from his wrist unit. The tiny screen blinked, then stuttered to life. There were files, not many. No headers, no formatting, just raw text strings, some audio fragments, and a compressed image set. He scrolled slowly, eyes scanning keywords, timestamps. The first report was dated 12 years prior. The location ID matched their grid. The compound they had destroyed, its name had been scrubbed, but the architectural blueprints embedded in the file told the story. It was built under an old U.S. defense contract during the late-stage bioweapons trials. Officially decommissioned. The signature on the final asset transfer was American. They had not taken down a rogue lab, they had erased one of their own. The second file showed more recent logs, encrypted exchanges between an embedded liaison and a third-party militia. The local official had provided coordinates for a low-resistance exfil corridor. Payment confirmation followed. The same corridor they'd walked into. The same one marked in red on Riker's map. He blinked once, jaw tight. Then he laid the map out again on his knee, next to the glowing screen. The contrast was sharp. The digital terrain overlays in the stolen file showed a different bend in the canyon, a wider exit point untouched by interference. Riker's map, trusted, annotated, handed to him before deployment, had been wrong. Not outdated, not misread, wrong by design. Penn shifted her weight, glanced up just as he turned the map. Her eyes followed the fold lines. She saw the blood near the corner where Griggs had pressed his arm. She didn't ask. She moved closer. Riker didn't explain. He just folded it again. Slower this time. The edge stuck where dried blood had stiffened the crease. He pressed harder. The paper cracked along the line. Shaw cleared his throat. They knew we'd take that path. His voice was quiet, barely above the static still hissing through his headset. Holt didn't look at them. He was seated at the cave wall, rifle across his lap, watching the entrance with eyes half-lidded but alert. We were the follow-through. No witnesses. No noise. Clean finish. No one corrected him. The silence that followed wasn't resignation, it was recognition. There would be no rescue, no retrieval team, no correction. The files on that drive told the real story, but they weren't meant to be read by anyone here. Riker's fingers rested on the map. He looked down at it one last time. The ink had blurred near the midpoint where moisture had soaked through. His own red notations had faded into pink edges, bleeding into terrain marks that no longer meant anything. A trap, printed and folded by someone who signed the operation as low risk. The dust on his gloves had darkened from blood. It caked between his fingers and caught in the knuckle creases. When he shifted his hand, a faint print remained on the map's edge. Behind him, Shaw's comm unit crackled faintly. Not a signal, just interference. A burst of static, then silence again. No call sign, no ping, just the quiet drag of failing bandwidth and distance. "We're not on their screen anymore," Penn said. Her voice didn't shake. "No," Riker replied. No one moved. The cave had become its own waiting room, a place between function and memory. The gear that hadn't been torn was coated now, dust ground into every seam. Blood dried in irregular streaks across their sleeves and knees. Their uniforms, once regulation tan, looked indistinguishable from the stone around them. Riker reached down, picked up the map again, and sealed it inside the inner flap of his vest. Not to use, just to carry. The truth wasn't something he could fix. It was just something he now held. They left the cave in darkness. There was no sunrise yet, just a pale seam of gray building behind the ridge. The wind had dropped again, but the cold remained. They moved slowly at first. Shaw couldn't walk unassisted, and Holt had taken a hard knock to the ribs during the retreat. Riker kept to the front, his hands working quietly over the laminated fragments Shaw had pulled from the stolen sat map. He'd overlaid them directly onto his own folded copy. Where they disagreed, he trusted Shaw's. The new path wasn't part of their original exit corridor. It hadn't been cleared. The topography marked it as unstable, steep, no satellite confirmation. But it was the only route that didn't take them through known kill zones or crossfire trails already watched. Riker didn't say this out loud. He just set his boots toward the tributary and moved. Penn adjusted her rifle strap and fell into step behind him, watching the slope with sharp, silent focus. Shaw leaned against her side. His left foot dragged slightly, not from pain, but from muscle gone slack. Holt brought up the rear, breathing audibly, favoring his right leg more with each step. The terrain narrowed fast, chalk shelves giving way to a bone-dry cut in the earth, angled just enough to keep them moving downhill but sharp enough to punish every step. The dust was worse here. It clung to their faces and weapons, sifted into their collars, mixed with the blood that hadn't fully dried on Shaw's bandages or Holt's sleeves. Visibility dropped as the path dipped, air thick with pale grit. Riker coughed into his shoulder and pushed forward. Shaw tried again with his gear, fingers clumsy but determined. He pulled a jumper cable from his damaged relay kit, bypassed the comm's power source, and hardwired directly into the antenna. It lit, blinked, then fizzled. A second later, a long burst of static burst through his earpiece. He shut his eyes and tapped the frequency scan again. No return, no signal, no traffic. The radio wasn't broken. There was simply no one left listening. Behind him, Holt stumbled. The sound of his boots scuffing across stone echoed too long. Penn turned. "We're not alone." Riker had already stopped moving. He raised his rifle just as the first muzzle flash flickered above them from a broken outcrop on the right slope. Rounds sparked against the cliff face. The team dropped instantly, Sliding behind what cover the path offered nothing more than fractured rock and shadow. Holt swung left and returned fire in bursts, gritting his teeth as his bad leg buckled behind him. Penn pulled Shaw down into a recess in the rock, pressed him flat, and returned fire uphill. The militia scouts had elevation, but not numbers. Close quarters. Bad angles. The lead rifleman leaned out for a better shot and caught a round from Riker's burst to the chest. He tumbled. Another pulled back into cover. A grenade bounced once on the upper ledge and dropped in slow arc toward them. Riker saw it and didn't shout. He grabbed the edge of a collapsed stone and hauled it over the drop point. It caught the grenade's blast, but the shockwave knocked Shaw's radio kit sideways, scattering parts. Dust exploded outward, coated everything again. Penn's hand was bleeding. Holt's leg gave out entirely and he crawled toward the wall, dragging himself on one arm. The last scout retreated. The echo of gunfire faded slowly, swallowed by terrain. Riker stayed low, eyes scanning the ridge above for movement. None came. Holt sat against the rock, breathing hard. Blood seeped through his pant leg. Penn moved to him, started to pull a morphine tab, but he pushed her hand away. "Not yet," he said through his teeth. "If I dull it, I stop pulling weight." Riker knelt beside Shaw, who was still conscious but not speaking. His lips were pale, fingers twitching. They couldn't stop here. He reached inside his vest, pulled the drive from his side pouch, and unfolded the map one last time. Its center crease had nearly split. He held it flat between his hands, looked at it like something no longer reliable but still the only thing he had. Then he turned to Penn. "You take this," he said. She didn't answer. She just looked at the map, then back at him. "If only one of us makes it out," he added. "This gets seen." He pressed the drive into her palm, folded the torn paper once more, and placed it on top. The tape barely held the crease. She nodded once. No speech. Just a shift in her weight, a subtle grip tightening around both items. She slid them into the side of her pack, sealing the flap quietly. They moved on. No one spoke for the next half hour. The path narrowed, then opened, then narrowed again. The sun finally touched the far ridge, turning the chalk rock a pale gold. Their shadows stretched long in front of them, moving slowly across the ground like ghosts trying to remember which direction mattered. By the time they reached the edge of the tributary, they had no water left, and only one functional radio still spitting static. Riker led. Penn walked behind him, Shaw's weight across her shoulder. Holt limped on his own. They were still being hunted, but they were still moving, and they carried the truth with them. Whether it mattered to anyone else no longer changed the fact that it existed. The outpost stood like a forgotten scar pressed into the hillside. Rust streaked down its sheet metal siding. The old satellite dish above the roof sagged at an angle, ribs exposed, cables long since snapped. The structure had no windows, just a single dented steel door and a sagging overhang of corrugated tin that rattled softly in the morning breeze. Riker saw it first, one hand raised to slow the others. He led them in through the side entrance, stepping over a collapsed beam, checking corners with the last round in his chamber. Inside, it smelled of dry mold and dust sealed in metal for decades. The radio room was at the back. Half the panels were gutted, but one console still had power. A low red light blinking beside the frequency dial. Shaw collapsed against the wall. His breath was shallow, but steady. Holt sank down near the entry, rifle still in hand. Blood soaked through the makeshift dressing wrapped around his leg. Penn moved to the transmitter. Her hands were cut, one sleeve torn. She slid the drive into the port and adjusted the frequency manually. Static flared, then dipped. She worked in silence. The old console flickered, hesitated, then locked. She entered the key sequence, copied the data over, and typed a single phrase into the header field. Legacy erasure. Confirmed. Beneath it, she added Riker's call sign. The last line she typed was a name, just one. The liaison who had sent them down the wrong path. She hit send. There was no tone, no confirmation ping, just the line of text flashing once, then vanishing from the screen. The signal had gone somewhere. Whether it was received no longer mattered. Outside, the sound changed. Gravel spun under tires. Engines revved low. A door slammed. Then footsteps. Riker turned from the hallway and looked at Holt. Neither of them spoke. They knew what was coming. He pointed once toward the back exit. Penn was already moving. She pulled Shaw upright and guided him down the narrow corridor leading behind the building. Holt rose slowly, bracing against the wall, then took up position beside Riker. The first round cracked through the front wall. They returned fire in controlled bursts. No shouting, no confusion, just the steady rhythm of suppressive fire against the growing swell of return shots. The inside of the outpost filled with haze, gunpowder smoke mixing with chalk grit from the surrounding rock. The air turned thick, visibility low. Blood trailed from Holt's leg across the metal floor. A grenade landed near the console. Riker kicked it sideways, catching the edge with his boot and deflecting the blast into the hallway. Shrapnel tore the panel beside him. The console darkened. Sparks snapped across the frame. One of the screen casings buckled inward. Penn looked back once from the threshold of the back exit. Riker nodded. She didn't wait. She pulled Shaw after her into the brush line beyond the back steps, disappearing between the slope and the tree line. Behind her, gunfire swelled into chaos. Then silence. Later, when the smoke thinned and the wind shifted again, a piece of metal glinted in the mud beneath the broken transmitter. Riker's dog tags. Penn saw them as she passed the ridgeline 20 minutes later. She didn't stop. She didn't reach for them. She let them stay where they had landed, half sunken in the dirt, flecked with ash. Some names didn't need to be recovered. Some legacies didn't ask to be written down. The walls were off-white, without texture or marks. A vent above the door rattled in a slow, even rhythm. The room had no windows. The lights were bright but soft enough to avoid reflection on the laminated table between them. Lila Penn sat upright, hands resting in her lap. Her uniform was regulation correct but faded at the collar. A thin, adhesive bandage ran along her left temple. She didn't look injured, only used. Across from her sat a man in a uniform without unit patches. He didn't introduce himself. His posture was exact. One hand rested on a tablet while the other clicked an invisible pen against the plastic edge of the desk. "Your statement was received," he said. "But the lab in question was previously flagged as a foreign asset under hostile control. Your assertion that it was originally American is unsupported." Penn didn't answer. She didn't nod. She just reached into her side pouch and removed the folded map. It no longer opened cleanly. The edges had been sealed together by heat and moisture. The blood had dried in a thin, uneven arc across the lower left quadrant. She placed it on the table, rotated it once so north faced the man in front of her, then removed her hand. He looked at it, briefly. The pause in his routine was short, but present. He didn't touch the paper. Instead, he tapped a line on his screen and said, "You are released from further obligation. Your record will reflect satisfactory conduct. Transportation has been arranged." He stood. The meeting was over. Penn remained seated until the door opened behind her. Then she rose, collected nothing, and stepped out into the hallway without speaking. The map stayed on the table. The man never looked at it again. Elsewhere, in a rehab ward, lined with gray tile and soft medical lighting, Andrew Shaw sat on the edge of a cot. One leg was in a brace. His hands were clean but still trembled slightly as he held a blank dog tag between his fingers. No serial number, no official issue. With a black permanent marker, he wrote a name in small, deliberate strokes. Jordan Riker. He threaded the tag onto a spare chain and placed it around his own neck, beneath the regulation one. He didn't say anything. The television in the far corner played without volume. Outside the window, a maintenance crew swept clean sidewalks free of autumn leaves. No one mentioned the drive. No report was confirmed. The folded map eventually found its way into an archive envelope marked Unverified Field Debrief. It was stored without classification. The ink would fade in time, but not all the stains would vanish. Some truths stayed quiet. Some names weren't written down where others could see them. But the people who carried them remembered anyway. The cliff stood silent beneath a colorless sky. Wind moved lightly across the high ridge, carrying fine powder that lifted and fell without urgency. The rock had bleached further in the time since chalk dust clung to its surfaces like memory, collecting in every fracture, every crease in the land where footsteps once passed. There were no tracks now, no tire marks, no bodies. The terrain had swallowed the battle as surely as it had witnessed it. Birds circled wide above the canyon, then settled again on a rusted length of rebar poking from a collapsed beam. The debris had shifted with the weather, softened by time. Bits of shattered gear remained twisted metal, fragments of ceramic plate, the edge of a broken lens, half buried in silt. Near the base of a cracked comms mast, something glinted, not bright, just enough to catch a shift in the light. A tag, thin, metallic, pressed into the mud where it had fallen and been left. No name visible from a distance, no hand reaching for it. Far from the cliffs, in a building without markings, a drawer slid shut. The file inside had a label stamped across its tab, Unconfirmed Asset Loss, Compromised. Inside, a single document carried a name, a time, a location. None of it had been opened again. Dust had started to collect along the folder's crease. But somewhere deep in the archive structure where old field traffic rotated across cold servers, one data packet remained active. It looped silently through an internal node. It contained no visual header, no top-level clearance tag, just a compressed message string. The file bore two things: a fragment of terrain telemetry and a note logged in Corpsman Penn's field signature. The last line listed a name. Not for attribution, not for commendation. The system hadn't purged it. The signal echoed once more through the relay buffer, faint, distorted, still alive. Back in the mountains, the wind shifted again, stirring another layer of dust across the collapsed structure. It moved without shape, like memory, brushing past the glint of metal in the soil, and then moving on. Sometimes the only thing left is what you carried, and who remembers that you did.